When we get through the Ten Commandments, then suddenly we switch to a quite different kind of laws. These are all what we call casuistic or case laws. If a man does X, then that, but if he does something else, then something else.
That's right.
Now, most of these laws don't make a whole lot of sense in the context of a community wandering around in the wilderness.
Right, when you find a thief tunneling under your house, for example.
Exactly. Or when you have to worry about your ox scoring somebody else's.
That's right.
When presumably you don't have an ox to begin with. Where do you think these laws come out of? They can hardly have been composed just for this context.
No, I think that's true. It does seem like they have some sort of independent origin. Maybe not every single one of them, but the idea of there being sort of a block of legislation.
Now, some people have made much of the fact that there's some resemblance between these laws and the laws of Hammurabi, great Babylonian king, about 1800 BC.
Yep.
Famous carryover one is the ox that gores.
That's right.
That this was kind of a topos in ancient Near Eastern law.
Yeah, there are a lot of them, not just with Hammurabi, but with other lesser-known Mesopotamian and Hittite law codes.
Yeah.
So it seems like, insofar as people had law codes, that Israel may have had one of its own as a way of matching.
How would that have worked? Did people in the ancient Near East actually use these as law codes so that if a case comes up, you can imagine the judge rummaging back through a scroll someplace to find the case?
Right. Hard to imagine in the case of Hammurabi, which is on a gigantic stone statue.
Well, then just go over and peer at it.
I guess so.
Yeah.
It depends on where you build your courthouse.
Yeah.
So no, the answer is these are not, I don't think these are intended to be what we think of as prescriptive law. I don't think the person or persons responsible for these laws in Exodus thought that they were writing something novel that somebody would then change their behavior or their rulings on the basis of. I think that these are more what we call descriptive law. That is, these laws exist, especially in their narrative context, to explain why it is that we do the things we do. Right? Why is it that we have that practice? Not because, in this case, not because some king said so, but because way back thousands of years ago, God told us that if you find a thief tunneling under your house, etc.
Yeah, and these, I would assume, must be at least illustrative.
Oh, at best illustrative.
The kinds of decisions that are, kinds of cases that
what
one
it's certainly
might
not is comprehensive.
But it is an interesting problem that in the ancient Near East it was nearly always the king. And it's quite remarkable that it's not a king here. Now, of course, if you want to put it back in the time of Moses, you don't have a king to attribute it to.
Right, Moses is the closest thing you got.
And Moses fills in for that. Okay, but let's look at a couple of them here. First one in chapter 21. When you purchase a Hebrew slave, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall be given his freedom without cost. What should surprise us about that law?
Slave?
I think most of us would be surprised that a Hebrew slave, didn't they get the point?
Right.
Well, apparently no, they didn't.
Right. I mean, there's a good chunk of laws at the beginning of this law code that are about slavery, about how you treat Hebrew slaves, about how you treat non-Hebrew slaves.
Yeah, and some of the notable variations. Now, it may well be, that what would have surprised people in the ancient world is that in the 7th year you're supposed to let him go free.
That's right.
That would be the startling limitation. But then you read on, and if it's a girl, if it's a daughter, well, she shouldn't go free the same way that the male slave does.
That's right. I mean, we should remember that there are probably different kinds of slavery at work here. Right? When an Israelite enslaves an Israelite, it's almost certainly what we think of as debt slavery.
Yeah.
Which is, they probably still had their own house. They probably were simply working off their debts. Until it was paid. And the idea is, after 7 years, if they haven't paid off their debt, we can let it go at that point, right? They've suffered enough. But there are non-Israelite slaves who are treated as poorly as any slave you could ever imagine.
Yeah. Now, in the case of the woman who isn't set free in the 7th year, is that good for her or bad for her? Could you see that as possibly because the woman wouldn't be able to fend for herself?
It's possible. It's possible. The status of women in the ancient world, in ancient Israel, is not what we would like to think of it as, I think it's safe enough to say. And some of the things that look to us to be oppressive may be, in fact, protective, but protective because of a sort of native oppression of
and
women
now,
in general.
of course, in that case, it is notable that Deuteronomy will change that and says you should go free. So, if Exodus is being protective, Deuteronomy isn't. But either way, it's not that good a scene.
No.
Also, one that I always enjoy in this is the case of a man who hits his slave.
Yeah.
And if the slave dies right away, then
Bad.
the man is guilty. If he lives for a couple of days, that's okay. After all, he was his slave.
Right. It says because he was his property.
Yeah. And, in that case, it seems to be, there must have been a slave owners lobby, who went to work on this and said, but, let's qualify it a little bit. Maybe if he lives for a couple of days.
Alternatively, the slaves had a union and they got the concession of a couple of days.
Now, a famous one here, though, when men fight and hurt a pregnant woman so that she suffers a miscarriage, but no further injury, the guilty one shall be fined as much as the woman's husband demands of him, and he shall pay in the presence of judges. But if injury ensues, you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. So let's start with the case where they hurt a pregnant woman. This is a celebrated verse, and why is that so?
This one is a little bit fraught in current debate. I mean, this is the only biblical verse almost that I think is relevant to the abortion debate. You, sir, are the master of biblical ethics. So you tell me, my sense is that you are going to say that this is, in fact, not relevant to the abortion debate.
That would be my own sense of it. Now, of course, it's relevant to the abortion debate because it's the verse that has been cited. And apart from this, there is no discussion of abortion anywhere in the Bible. Now, it's not that abortion wasn't known. We know even how they did it in Egypt and Assyria, in the ancient world. And Jeremiah, in one of his darker moments, says, I wish I'd been aborted. I wish somebody had killed me in the womb. So, it must have been known. It must have been done to some degree. Why don't they acknowledge it at all? Because what you've got here definitely is not abortion. It's a miscarriage. A miscarriage that's caused accidentally. But it's not like parents saying we want to terminate this pregnancy.
And I think the real question in this passage, when it talks about there is no further injury, is that injury to the fetus or is that injury to the mother?
I would figure that's injury to the mother.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I think so too.
And now there is that phrase actually is the subject also of a long discussion because it's an unusual Hebrew word, ason, and the people who translated the Bible into Greek evidently didn't understand it. And so they said, and if the baby comes out unformed.
Right.
And then you get the whole discussion of abortion in later, already before the turn of the year, and people like Philo of Alexandria and Josephus. And for them, the big issue was the fetus fully formed? And in some of the later tradition, it's if the crown of the head has appeared, then it's a person.
Right.
And before that, no. No, I mean, it would be hard to take any of that, I think, as normative for the modern world. They just didn't have the same kind of understanding of the fetus and whatever is going on in the womb that we have later on. But it is remarkable that the Bible says nothing really about it. In the New Testament, there is a passage in the book of Revelation, that talks about pharmaceutes, people who use drugs of a certain sort, and some people thought maybe that's an allusion to it, but not very clearly so. And, you know, the funny part about this is that I think if you ask a lot of religious people on the street, you know, what are really important issues in the Bible, they'll probably say that it's against abortion.
Yeah.
In antiquity, in fairness be it said, Jews were known for not exposing infants. But still, that's a somewhat different case.
I would say that's a somewhat different case, yeah.
Now, the end of this then is also famous, of course.
Eye for an eye.
An eye for an eye. Did they do that? Were there a lot of one-eyed Jacks?
You would think that if there were, they would have to be all one-eyed, right?
I know, yeah.
Right? It's clear enough. In fact, this is a great example of why some of these comparative studies of the Israelite law and sort of the Code of Hammurabi are useful. The same law, what we call the law of talion, right, eye for an eye, exists in these Mesopotamian laws, where it explicitly says, eye for an eye, by which I mean you're going to pay the monetary value of, right? Yeah. They convert it into a financial penalty. Yeah. The Bible doesn't, but I'm pretty sure they must have had it in mind, because otherwise, you know, the social consequences would be fairly destructive. I think that's safe to say.
Yeah. You know, this is often derided, I would say. Certainly in Christian circles. I don't know how people feel about it in the Jewish tradition. It may be a little different. But in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Gospels, you see, Jesus says, that you have heard it was said to them of old, an eye for an eye, but I say to you, turn the other cheek, and that. But now, if you're making a law for the people, which would you actually want to be the law?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like if you take eye for an eye seriously, it's a very strong preventative.
Yeah.
Right. That's a good way to get people to not hurt each other. Right. If you hit someone, that they're going to be able to hit you back just as hard. In fact, they're going to be legally almost obligated to.
Yeah, but I would say, you know, that this is probably a law of moderation.
Oh yeah.
Because it's saying if somebody knocks out one of your eyes, you are not allowed to knock out both of his. So it's limitation. It's the Mikado. It's make the punishment fit the crime.
That's right.
Which is not unreasonable. Now, the other thing that would strike a lot of people reading through these laws, I think, is the frequency of the death penalty.
Yep.
And this was something of which people like Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, a historian writing in the 1st century, were very proud. And they said, this shows how superior our laws are to those of the Greeks and the Romans. Why do you think they appeal to the death penalty so much?
I think the basic first observation is that death was a lot more prevalent and a lot more common, visible, open in the ancient world.
Actually, I thought everybody still died, but
but you don't see people die very often.
Yeah.
We don't encounter death, right? We have hospitals. Death is cordoned off.
It's cordoned off. It's out of sight.
Whereas
right. Yeah.
Death in the ancient world, as state punishment, as individual punishment, as simply a fact of life, constant. I mean, these were people who had animals living in their houses, right? They saw death all the time, of all sorts. So our sort of aversion to the death penalty is in part, I think, a cultural shift. Back then, death was just much easier, much cheaper.
What kind of a prison system did they have? Nothing to compare with the United States, at any rate, right?
Well,
they did. The prisons were known, but I think they would have been pretty exceptional.
And I think they were mostly. It sounds like they were mostly debtors' prisons, right? They were maybe. I'm reading the French Revolution back too much, but
the famous cases that come to my mind are in the Joseph story, where it's in Egypt, of course,
right,
and Jeremiah. But even with Jeremiah, they had to improvise and drop him down a well, as I recall. So I think the facilities probably weren't too good. There's one other thing, though, that I think should be said about the death penalty here, frequent as it is. You don't have it for property crimes. And that, I think, is quite remarkable in the context.